Okay, welcome to Plants and Limiting Factors. This is another attempt at this lecture for SD 3100, Principles of Agroecology. So we're going to talk about plants and limiting factors. And limiting factors here, we mean nutrients, the different elements that are required for plant growth, but we also mean other environmental factors which can limit plant growth. So temperature, light availability, and water in general. So we're going to think conceptually about each of these. So we have two main objectives for this lecture. The first one is to understand multiple limiting factors, how the multiple limiting factors combine to affect plant growth in agroecosystems. And so we're going to think about these different individual factors, but also how do they combine to affect plant growth. And we also want to broadly understand how environmental factors regulate plant growth and development throughout its life cycle. The photo on the right is one we've used before, but it shows a home garden in Indonesia, and you can see coconut trees, you can see bananas, we can see cassava or yucca plants in the foreground, you can see kind of larger timber species. And the reason I put this here is to be thinking is when we look at this, we see these plants growing, but we also want to be trying to think about the different nutrients that are moving through this system, and which are essential both for the growth of the plants, but also what we're hoping to get from these plants as well. So we're going to think about what are the different factors that are working, the kind of myriad factors that are working together to control plant growth in a complex environment like this. Okay, let's start by thinking, kind of building on what we talked about in the last lecture, which was photosynthesis. And although, so we talked about photosynthesis as being this process by which plants use water, light, and carbon dioxide in order to grow. And that's true. Those are essential parts of photosynthesis. But plant growth is more than just those aspects of photosynthesis. Plants need other nutrients and environmental factors in order to be able to grow. In a sense, I kind of want to think about this as a way to question this notion, which we introduced in the last lecture, that plants are autotrophic or self-nourishing. In a sense, they're not really self-nourishing. They're not really independent. They remain dependent upon the presence of these other factors within the environment. They're not completely kind of on their own. They are dependent. The photo in the upper right is one that's kind of a particular pet peeve of mine. You'll see on social media where people say, take the bottom of your lettuce and put it in a bowl of water and you'll grow a new head of lettuce. And while it's true that a plant can actually kind of reallocate some of the nutrients that are in the old part of the plant and kind of re-sprout, you can't grow something from nothing. You can't simply take the bottom of a celery plant and keep growing more lettuce out of just water. You need these other nutrients in order to do it, right? So it's not kind of this is just a way to be thinking about the fact that we need these other nutrients, and we get them typically from the soil is where plants are getting these from. Okay, so let's start by talking about nutrients. We typically break nutrients into macronutrients and micronutrients, both of which are essential for plant growth. The division between them is really just based on the amount of each of these that are needed rather than their importance, right? So the macronutrients are needed in larger volume than the micronutrients, but they're all essential. So on the left, we have the 6 key macronutrients, which include nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. I've highlighted the first 3 of these, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, because we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. They're also kind of some of the ones that we focus on. So if you go out and want to buy fertilizer for your plants, whether it's organic or kind of industrial fertilizers are characterized by the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that they include by weight. And so these are really kind of the key macronutrients that we tend to focus on. Micronutrients include, but aren't limited to, iron, copper, zinc, molybdenum, boron, and chloride. So these are common micronutrients. There's others that are often needed by some plants, but not necessarily by all. And these are needed in smaller volumes than the macronutrients. But if they're not there, they're no less important. I've included a historical reference here because I think it's important conceptually. So Justus von Liebig in the 1870s kind of identified the importance of individual elements in plant nutrition. So he kind of identified that that plants needed nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and kind of set up for identifying what other nutrients were as well. And before this, the notion was that plant growth was controlled by organic processes. And this is a little different notion of organic than we think of now organic in agriculture. So it wasn't that it was kind of natural and non-industrial processes, but organic in the sense of being holistic, that there was a sense of a set of integrated forces that you didn't need to decompose and figure out what were the individual pieces, but that it worked as a whole. So in many ways, von Liebig's insights were really important. They helped us identify kind of what were some of the intricacies that were working in that complex whole. But it also set us up for an industrial agriculture that focused more on the parts rather than the functioning of the whole. And you can think of this as a more reductionist approach. And we've talked about this a little in the past, that ecosystems, and in a sense more sustainable agroecosystems, work well when we kind of take advantage of complex processes that help keep things in balance. If we start to decompose or kind of if we start to decompose the processes, we then have to make sure each of the elements are there individually, and it makes it harder to manage and maybe even more susceptible to kind of going into imbalance, right? So just want to think about this as a system. We want to remember the importance of these nutrients, but we also don't want to lose sight of what we might lose by focusing too much on them individually. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 of these nutrients in specifics just because they're really important. That doesn't mean that the others aren't important, but we don't want to get lost in the weeds of all of the nutrients. You can each of the other macro and micronutrients have a similar kind of story about why they're important, and you can kind of find out more about that. So let's start with nitrogen. So nitrogen makes up about 1 to 2% of the dry weight of most plants and of most crops. So if I took this broccoli plant, this young broccoli plant, if I dried it and then kind of chemically analyzed what I would have, only about 1 to 2% of it would be nitrogen. Much of it would be carbon and some hydrogen and some oxygen that would be embedded there as well. But I mean, mainly the carbon is what we'd be kind of left with in terms of its mass. The nitrogen, though, has a disproportionate kind of impact because it's important in processes and structural components like chlorophyll and enzymes, which are really important for other processes like photosynthesis within the plant. It's needed, even though it accounts for a small amount of the mass of the plant, it's needed in relatively large amounts for these kind of ongoing processes. And in terrestrial plants, like most agroecosystems, it's the most commonly deficient nutrient. And that's partly because there aren't large supplies or stocks of it in natural systems, and we're reliant on what flows through the system rather than stocks that are in the system. It's often important for flowering and fruit set. It's also important because nitrogen is essential for every amino acid, and these are essential in making protein. So if we think about the proteins from beans or grains, these are coming from amino acids, built up by amino acids, which include nitrogen as an essential element in them. So the nitrogen is important for plant function and its own nutrition, but it's also important for our nutrition in that. If we think about it in agroecosystems. Plants get most of their nitrogen from the soil solution. So this is nitrogen that's dissolved in the small amount of water that's held in soil, and it's held in the form of nitrate, which is the most commonly used and absorbed by plants, or ammonium, which is also accessible for some plants. Nitrogen stocks in soil are typically low. So you can think about this is that there's not like a big inventory of it that's just waiting there for plants to use. plants tend to be relying on nitrogen that's moving through the system, flow rather than a stock. Some species, some plant species, can fix atmospheric nitrogen, so nitrogen from the atmosphere, through the symbiotic relationship with rhizobial bacteria in their roots. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. I included a broccoli plant for this because just to kind of think about this, if you apply nitrogen at the wrong time for a broccoli plant, it'll put that into chlorophyll, into producing leaves. It'll be able to do more leaves. But really what we want from a broccoli plant is we want a big flower, a kind of crazy big flower. And you can see there's just a tiny little broccoli floret starting. But we've selected these brassicas to create really absurd flowers that we love to eat in a broccoli floret. And so we don't want more foliage. We actually want more flower. And so you have to be careful when we apply the nitrogen, because we want leaves early so that it can start to photosynthesize, but we don't want leaves once it's getting ready to form a flower. Okay, the second nutrient that macronutrient we're going to talk about is phosphorus. Phosphorus is also important for some key functions within plants. So it's important for nucleic acids. So these are kind of essential for DNA and plant functions, and kind of writing the programs, the kind of DNA function within plant cells. Phosphorus is also important for proteins, just like nitrogen. It's a key component of cell walls in plants, which are important both structurally and functionally. And it's also a component, it's the P in ATP. And ATP is a chemical which stores energy for plants. You can think of this as kind of the gasoline for a plant. So it's important, for instance, in photosynthesis because it's part of the process by which plants transfer light energy that's absorbed during the light reactions, photosynthesis, and it's made then available for the dark reactions where carbon is fixed within photosynthesis. So it's an important kind of so phosphorus is important for this chemical which embodies energy, transfers energy within a cell. Phosphorus is primarily absorbed as phosphates through the roots, which is why I've got a little bean here with some fine roots that are being developed. So it's important both for root growth, and then the roots are essential in kind of scavenging. They're essential for scavenging or finding the phosphorus that's in the soil and then absorbing it. Phosphorus can also be really important for fruit development in some plants. So phosphorus, and we'll talk about phosphorus more kind of in the soil in the next lecture. Phosphorus is easily absorbed by a plant when it's in solution. So when it's dissolved as phosphates in the soil water, the soil solution, plants can get at it. But oftentimes, one of two things happens. Either the parent material, so the rock that's forming the soil, is low in phosphorus, so there's not a lot of phosphorus around, or the phosphorus that's there is locked up and kind of held very tightly by the soil. So sometimes the soil wants to essentially hang on to that phosphorus and keep it locked up rather than allowing it to go into solution. And so that's what often makes phosphorus a limiting nutrient, is that it's either not there at all in the soil, or it's being locked up and isn't allowed into the soil solution or into the soil water. Okay, the third macronutrient we're going to talk about is potassium. And so potassium isn't important for kind of structural elements like nitrogen and phosphorus. It's not important for proteins or chlorophyll or other enzymatic reactions. But it is important because potassium exists as an ion. So it's a charged particle which can grab onto other chemicals and nutrients, and it can transport them. It's important in transporting them across cell boundaries. And so it kind of serves like a salt in moving nutrients and moving fluid within plants. So it's essentially a chemical kind of transport for nutrients, especially across cell boundaries and moving them kind of within different different parts of cells. The lack, so inadequate potassium, can lead to root rot, wilting, and increased disease incidence. And kind of what we see on the right here is a potassium deficiency in a tomato plant. And I put this in here too because sometimes for different, not just for these 3 macronutrients, but for other nutrients as well, is there are signs that you can easily see. If you've got a plant that you see is struggling and you wanted to Google yellow leaves in tomato, you'll find that that's a sign of, and often as one sign of potassium deficiency. And so it's a good, looking for these signs is a good way to figure out what nutrient might be limiting in a particular plant. And again, it's absorbed primarily through the roots in plants. Okay, micronutrients, and we're not going to go into the specific micronutrients, but on the right there's a table with 6 of the most common micronutrients, including boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. And the reason I include this is not so much that you need to understand or remember each of these micronutrients or its function, but it's that you understand that each of the micronutrients is important because it's important for a function. It's important for a process, right? So kind of understanding the complexity, each one of these is playing a role in a complex set of processes. And so, which are more or less important in different plants, but each of these can be important. I've also included a picture on the left, which kind of is just a way to kind of think about diverse fruits and vegetables. There is also a piece of salmon in there someplace, but you don't need to pay attention to that. And I put this in because, as a reminder, that micronutrients are not just important for plant health, but they're also important for our health. So they're one of the reasons that we kind of want to consume fruits and vegetables, which is for kind of vitamins and the nutrients that they bring. And so these are essential both for the plant's growth, but also for our health that we get from it. There's a debate that goes on right now about whether conventionally grown fruits and vegetables, which are really kind of focused on maximizing overall growth and volume of growth, and they're really focusing on providing nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, whether that focus leaves plants with lower concentrations of micronutrients. And there's certainly some evidence that that is the case, but although it's not a completely determined or decided question. But I just want us to be thinking about the fact that these are complex in getting plants to grow. We often don't see these micronutrients, but they can be important to us for many reasons. Okay, a couple last slides on conceptually thinking about limiting factors and tolerances. And again, when we think about limiting factors, I want us to think about those nutrients, all the macronutrients, the micronutrients, but also think about temperature, light, water as other limiting factors. So these are environmental factors which will limit or determine growth. I want to start by thinking conceptually about some key concepts. In particular, these first 3 I want us to focus on. And the first one is this notion of balanced nutrition, that all of these nutrients and factors are needed. They need to be present in adequate supplies, otherwise plants can't develop appropriately. And there's a parallel, we know, for our own nutrition, that we need to have a balance. Yes, there are diets that say you need a lot of protein or a lot of carbohydrates or a lot of fats, but really we kind of know that we need a balance of these things in order to be healthy, right? So we think about this as a whole rather than too much of a good thing. The second kind of key concept, which is a corollary of the first, is that growth is limited by the element that's in the shortest supply. Now, you can think of this euphemistically as a chain is as strong as its weakest link, right? So if there are a lot of different nutrients that are that might be present, but if there's one that's missing, that's what's going to hold up growth. It's going to be the Achilles heel of the growth. It's another way to kind of think of this, right? So if a plant is deficient in potassium, but has enough nitrogen, if I add more nitrogen, it won't grow anymore. I need to get the potassium up, right? So it's going to be held back by the potassium. If I get the potassium up to the right level, but then there's not enough water to support that, I need to get the water up, right? So it's going to be this kind of this kind of constant being held back by the part that's most missing. So this is another kind of notion of balance. Is we need a balance of all of these pieces, but they all have to be kind of rising at the same time to get optimal growth. The third concept, which is also kind of a corollary of the first, which is the law of diminishing returns, which basically just means more is not always better. So if a plant is low on nitrogen and I add more nitrogen, it'll grow more. And if I add more nitrogen, it'll grow some more. If I keep doing that, though, eventually it's got as much nitrogen as it needs. And if I do more, it's going to be too much, right? And so diminishing returns means more is not better. I can't just keep adding one element and expect the plant to grow more and more. And part of this is because there's likely to be another element that's missing, but also because eventually it just becomes too much and it becomes toxic. The last 2 points are more kind of smaller points. The first of those is that different plants have different nutritional needs. So this, what's the sweet spot, what's the right amount for each nutrient, is going to be different for different plants. And the last one is that for some nutrients or some elements at a particular level might be toxic for one plant, but crucial for another plant, right? So that those different plants are needed, or different amounts are needed for different plants. Okay, a little bit more on thinking about these notions about diminishing returns and kind of what's the right amount, what's the sweet spot. So we can think about plants' response to different factors, limiting factors in the environment in this way. So the graph on the right shows across the bottom is factor intensity. So you can think of this as how much nitrogen, how much water, what temperature, how much boron, whichever factor we want to think about. And on the vertical axis, how much response or how much growth. So this tells us the graph, this kind of bell curve here shows us kind of how a plant might respond to the amount of a given factor, a given nutrient or a given environmental factor. And with this, the key to this is to think that below a certain level, below a certain minimum tolerance level, a plant simply can't grow. If you don't have a certain amount, it's not going to be able to grow. If it doesn't have enough, if it doesn't have a certain amount of water, you're not even going to get the seed to germinate. If it doesn't reach a certain temperature, a plant won't grow. It's that minimum amount is needed. And once you get that minimum, in general, the more of that factor is better. You get more growth, the more you get of that factor. And it starts to then really take off, and you get to a point where the plant's got enough of that factor. It doesn't need anymore. In fact, then it gets to the point where there's too much of that factor, and you pass the optimum functioning, and you start to get less response because you've essentially got too much of a good thing, right? And eventually you get to the point where there might be so much of a good thing that you exceed the tolerance, you exceed this maximum tolerance level. And again, you could think of this for nitrogen, but I could also think about this for water. I could think about, you could have not enough water to grow, and I could have too much water so that a plant can't grow, right? And again, we can think about this for each nutrient. We can think about this for temperature. We can think about it for water. We can think about it for light. The same kind of function happens. You can also think about plants as falling into kind of across a spectrum that's defined by, at the one extreme, specialist organisms. And so specialist organisms they need a very particular set of conditions in order to grow. So you can think about this as being a very narrow bell curve. Is that if it needs a good amount of nitrogen, and then it only can accept a certain, or it only tolerate a certain amount. So it may have a very narrow band within which it's going to grow optimally or even at all. So it's got a particular set, and it might have a narrow band for nitrogen, a narrow band for temperature, a narrow band for water. That all of those have to be just right. So specialist organisms require very particular, very specific conditions. Generalist organisms have evolved to be able to work across a wide range of conditions. You can think of this as they could tolerate a little bit of water or a lot of water. They can work optimally across a range of conditions, and so they would have a wide band or a wide bell curve. And again, all of these curves are happening for different factors at the same time. Okay. We can also think within each of these curves, right? So there are a set of processes. There's nothing magic about these bell curves. They're usually the product of different processes, complex processes happening within a plant. So this is an example looking at temperature and plant response or growth in a plant. So the plant's overall growth rate in response to temperature is shown in this blue line. So below a certain temperature, a plant won't grow. As it gets warmer, it grows well, but if it gets too hot, it doesn't grow. But that doesn't work. It doesn't operate at a whole level. It's really the product of these different functions. So it's because enzyme activity has its own curve. It can only happen under certain temperature ranges. Respiration rates are kind of have their own relationship with temperature, and photosynthesis does as well. So the blue is kind of a composite of a whole set of processes that are functioning behind it, right? So every factor has a curve that's like the blue, and if we broke it down, it would be based on these different processes that are driving it. But really, if we look at the plant as a whole, it's the product of a whole set of other factors that are working in the same way at the same time, creating a complex story. Last thing is I want us to think a little bit about the fact that plants have complex life cycles and that they are affected by these environmental factors, limiting factors, differentially over time. So what affects them during seed germination, establishment, growth, flowering, fruiting might be quite different. Nevertheless, we can think about a couple of categories of responses that plants have to their environment. The first one is a triggered response, and this is this notion that certain conditions have to be encountered by a plant in order for it to act, but those conditions don't have to remain present for it to continue. So an example of that might be a number of plants have seeds that in order to germinate, they have to go through what's called cold stratification. They have to go through a period of cold. And in a way, you can think of this as a plant that forms a seed in the fall and then needs, in order to germinate, wants to know that it's spring. So it knows it's spring because it's gone through a winter. So it requires cold stratification because the cold stratification is the trigger that tells it, now you've gone through winter. Once it gets warm, you can start growing again. It doesn't have to stay cold. In fact, it shouldn't stay cold, but it needs to go through that process. So it needs to encounter that condition, and then it doesn't need it. The second is a dependent response, and this is a condition that needs to be encountered and then maintained. And so you can think of this as kind of water availability. And so the picture on the left is of a tomato plant. And tomato plants are particularly notorious for their susceptibility to drought. So if they go through a drought stress or a water stress period, they can't recover from it. Their growth gets essentially stopped, and you can't just put more water in and expect them to grow back. If they wilt and die back too hard or kind of get too affected by drought, they just essentially are stunted for the remainder of their period. So they have to encounter that water, and it has to be maintained for the plant to continue. Plants during their life cycle also have independent responses, and so these are responses that are independent of the environment. These are programmed actions that are kind of written into the genetics, the DNA of the plant, and they're really about physiological stages that follow a particular set of instructions. And they're less important. They're less reliant on the environment, these independent responses. And again, these change across the life cycle from germination, establishment, and growth to flowering and fruit set, etc. Okay. So a quick review. Are plants really autotrophic? Are they really self-nourishing? Obviously, I put this here because I want you to think they're not really. They really are dependent upon their environment. They are I would say magical, but they're incredible in the sense, or they're unique in the sense that they can produce energy and sequester carbon through photosynthesis, but they're not completely independent of their environment. Have this notion of macro and micronutrients, which are divided based on the amount that's needed by a plant. I do want you to kind of remember nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but I also want you to remember that each of these nutrients plays an important role, and that you can figure out what that role is for a particular plant. And if you're trying to grow it and having problems, that oftentimes understanding those individual nutrients' roles can be important, understanding what the problem might be. And after having told you that we want to think about these individual nutrients, I also want you to think about them as a whole. That just, it's not always about being able to break it down and decompose it into its individual nutrients, but thinking about how do we provide them as a whole? How do we create a system that has a balanced nutrition rather than just thinking about these individual nutrients? Complexity and limiting factors. And so I want you to think about a couple of things. The first is this reminder that the effect of limiting factors on plant growth is not linear. More is not better. There's a law of diminishing returns. And this is because the individual processes within a plant kind of mean that the limiting factor affects different processes which affect growth as a whole. Right? So it's nonlinear. More is not better. There's this optimum range. The second part of complexity is this understanding that all of these different limiting factors are kind of working and at the same time. And so finding the right combination of optimum conditions for each of the different pieces is essential in finding the right kind of niche, the right sweet spot for the plant as a whole. So we've got complexity for each factor, but we also have complexity because the factors have to work together. The last point is that there's complexity in the response of plants to the environmental factors. In particular, there's complexity across the life cycle of a plant, and that some things need to be encountered just once, some things need to be encountered repeatedly, and that those work together across the life cycle. Just as a reminder, don't forget to take the quiz that you can find on As You Learn. Thanks a lot.